Hello, I'm David Bowman, the tutoring coordinator for BCSCR, a project of the Three Rivers Education Foundation. And we've just finished running all of the tutor payments for the March tutoring, which will be going out tomorrow. I'm sure many of you will be happy to hear that. But I want to take a few minutes and address a concern or a question that I hear very regularly from tutors, which is exactly how do we make sure that the instructional activities we describe align with the reading components, and how do we start describing our instructional activities in a way that makes sense but is still fairly concise. So we're going to take a few minutes. We're going to look at 15 examples of the actual instructional activity descriptions that tutors have submitted during the last month. But before we do that, I want to give you a sense of perspective. So this right here, these are all of the tutor paperwork, all the tutor session logs and instructional reporting forms that we received for March tutoring. Now, to give you an idea of perspective, this orange one right here, this is a 500-page ream, so you can sort of estimate how many pages we have to go through each month when we're running payments. Now, the reason why I bring this up is fairly simple. We have to go fairly quickly, which means we don't have a lot of time to try to interpret and guess and speculate on what it is that tutors are doing. We really have just moments to look at each tutor's documentation to try to get an understanding not only of how many hours were served, but what it is that the tutor is doing during that month. So clear and concise yet accurate descriptions are very important. However, even with that in mind, I still look fairly carefully at the alignment between the activities that the tutor is describing and the reading components that the tutor indicates he or she is addressing in a particular session. And that really is what we're going to take a look at here. So let's run through some examples and look at the actual language. We're going to look at what was stated, what components the tutor indicated, and based on my review, what components the tutor actually seems to be addressing. So I do recommend that if you haven't yet seen the video on the instructional reporting form review, I would go see that first, because it does walk through each of the required reading components and give some ideas about the types of strategies that I'm looking for when I am analyzing the instructional activities. So, what makes phonics, what makes phonemic awareness, what makes fluency, comprehension, and so forth. What types of things am I looking for? Now, obviously, you come up with the actual activities, but I try to fit your activities into known strategies, into the research-based strategies that we propose and utilize through BCSCR. So if you haven't seen that video yet, go take a look at that one. It will give you ideas about the strategies, the concepts that we're looking for to be addressed, and the kinds of things that I think about when I'm doing the review of your forms. So go look at that one first. Now, if you have already seen that one, this one will make a lot more sense. So let's start walking through some examples. We're going to read the example. We're going to see what the tutor indicated and what I think actually happened. So the first example is this. The tutor writes, read, choral read, a pencil sandwich, sequencing, author's purpose, main idea, PH makes F sound, practice final E rule to decode unknown words, high frequency words, close activity. All right, and what the tutor indicated was that she addressed all 6 areas. We've got phonemic awareness, which is that whole PH and F sound and the final E rule. That also gives us phonics, because we're going to apply that rule to the pronunciation of the word. We have some fluency, which is the FLC, going on in there because we have that choral reading. We have some vocabulary study, which is done through the close activity. We have Comprehension, the sequencing, we even have some oral language development where in this case we're trying to understand the author's purpose and the message that the author is trying to relate. So the tutor indicated all 6 areas. I also indicate all 6 areas. I think that in this session right here, which if I remember correctly was an hour and 25 hour point 25 1.25 hours, I think the tutor hit every area. So this is a very good example. And you'll notice it's a fairly short summary of what happened, and yet it does indicate that each of the required components have been addressed. So a good example. Now in this one, the tutor writes Magic Treehouse, Fluency, Vocabulary, Comprehension, Main Idea, Game. So the tutor indicates that she addressed all 6 areas, and yet the only activity that I really see here is the one that says comprehension, main idea, game. So I'm only going to give her a pass on comprehension. She mentions fluency and vocabulary, but there are no activities there. We don't know what she did. So she says she addresses fluency, addresses vocabulary, but I'm left with the question, well, what did you do to address them? I don't see any activities that suggest how she addressed fluency, how she addressed vocabulary. So I can't really give them a check for those. Example 3. Again, in this one, the tutor indicates that all of the 6 areas have been addressed. Students close read a story called Army Dad. Students had to identify unfamiliar words and look for context clues for their meaning. Students used multi-strategy questioning to maintain comprehension skills. Each close read requires 4 different reads to account for fluency. And the tutor indicates all 6 areas. Okay, so we have some oral language development for sure, which could come out of the multi-strategy questioning. That whole questioning, because that discussion piece is very important to the development of oral language skills. Similarly with comprehension, I think we can get from there to comprehension. We have vocabulary, the whole looking for unfamiliar words and identifying context clues. We have some fluency going on. We've got multiple read-throughs taking place here, which is very nice to see. We have that repeated practice. But what I don't see is anything having to do with that combination of letters and sounds or the identification of sounds within words. So I couldn't put a check for phonemic awareness or phonics in this particular case. Example 4. Went over a list of new sight words. The, does, is, and are. The tutor indicates that phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension were all addressed, and yet this is the entire description of the session. I don't see any activities. I don't see how we would get from this to most of those areas. Now, I can give it a pass for vocabulary because we're looking at new sight words, so we have to talk about those words perhaps. And maybe phonics. So I've got a question mark by phonics because it kind of depends on the manner in which the students engaged in these new sight words. So maybe on phonics, probably on vocabulary, but I don't see any phonemic awareness. We're not studying sounds here. I don't see anything for fluency. There's no reading aloud, guided oral reading, any of that. No repeated out loud reading. And there are no comprehension activities here or text comprehension. So really all I could say is probably vocabulary, maybe phonics. In example 5, students reviewed alphabet booklets, letters in through Q, repeating sounds, guided and repeated oral reading of 2 books that students alternated reading. Students were questioned about the story, content, and characters. Students were asked to reflect on book content and responded orally. Okay, so the tutor indicated that fluency is addressed, and that I see that whole guided oral reading. That comprehension was addressed. We've got questions about the story and the content and characters, good, and oral language development, reflecting on the book content, giving their own perspective of it, describing their own ideas. So that would work for oral language development and actually for comprehension. So that's kind of a twofer in that case. Well, I agreed with all of that, but I would also add the phonemic awareness piece because we're looking at also specific sounds that we're looking for within the words, and that's the alphabet booklets and repeating sounds. So I would actually add one more to this. I would add the phonemic awareness piece as well. But this tutor has done a pretty good job on describing accurately and aligning the activities to the reading components. In example 6, we have this description. Number the stars. Students continue to read aloud and stop to discuss unfamiliar words. Students keep a dictionary to use as a reference, though we come up with a working definition based on the content of the story. Compare and contrast. We discuss differences between the characters and how the families are living. Each student came up with a statement that compares and contrasts the two girls. And the tutor said fluency because we have that reading aloud. We have that sort of guided oral practice. We're reading aloud. We're stopping when we stumble on new words and so forth. We have vocabulary going on there. We're developing some definitions, not just looking up, but we even have some of that vocabulary discovery or meaning discovery, which I really like to see. We obviously have some comprehension going on there. We've got that whole compare and contrast between the characters and some oral language development where they have to be able to express their own ideas. Now, often with oral language development, we're trying to look at what is the author's perspective, or what does a character mean by something, or how is language being used in a particular case. But when we have students also describing their own ideas and opinions, and we have to engage them in really articulating their ideas, that is also going to fit under oral language development. Well, so that's what the tutor indicated, and I agreed completely. I think this tutor nailed it and has an accurate description of what actually happened during this session. Example 7, figurative language. Students use examples of alliteration, onomatopoeia, metaphor, simile, personification, irony, hyperbole, as well as cliches to familiarize with them for future use. So again, I'm agreeing with the tutor on this one completely. I think we've got phonemic awareness going on there because if we're talking about alliteration, then obviously we've got to be talking about the sounds of words. I think we have some phonics going on there because obviously we're going to look at the printed word, we're going to translate it into sounds, and then come up with the word itself, so that's phonics. We have vocabulary because we're going to be looking at examples of all these things, and quite possibly these terms themselves are a good study in vocabulary. And we've got some oral language development because if we're talking about irony and hyperbole and cliches, those are all issues of how people use language in a particular context and what they might be trying to indicate by using those types of figures of speech. That's oral language development. So I give the tutor a pass on all of these. I think this is an accurate alignment between the activities and the reading components. Now in example 8, we have the tutor saying, students completed answering the comprehension questions previously started in writing. After they proofread their writing, the teacher proofread and approved for student to type their answers on a Word document. Students then edited and printed the final work. Now the tutor indicated phonics, fluency, and comprehension. But when I look at this, I don't see any phonics in here. I don't see that translation from written letters, written symbols into oral language. So I don't see anything phonics there. I also don't see any fluency. There's not any reading aloud going on. There's no repeated practice or choral reading or guided oral reading, or the students aren't even reading aloud. So I don't see any fluency here. And comprehension, I would say yes for comprehension in this case because one of the things, obviously the student is answering comprehension questions or answering questions to indicate their comprehension. And that writing piece is actually pretty good for helping students to reflect on the content of the text. That's really where writing becomes very powerful within a reading program, and that's happening here. Now, So I'm going to say I don't see the phonics and I don't see the fluency, but I do see the comprehension. And maybe I've got a question mark as a maybe we can go from this activity to oral language development, depending on what those questions are. So it's a maybe and what kinds of responses they're being asked to give to various questions. Now, but however, looking at this, there's a lot going on in this session. The proofreading and typing and editing and all of that. Editing, maybe oral language development. They're having to think about the way that they're expressing their language depending on the nature and the depth of the editing. So again, a question mark. But all the proofreading and approving and the typing, that really doesn't get us to improvements in reading instruction. So in this particular case, I think the students actually lost a lot of good instructional opportunities, lost a lot of good instructional time. And I'm going to guess that the students really aren't very fast typers either. So a lot of time may have been taken up for this, and really what we got out of it is some comprehension. Now, writing their ideas is great, but perhaps at that point they could have discussed them within the group of students, and the teacher then could ask more probing questions in response to the students' answers. That would have been a great opportunity to really start moving up the various levels of Bloom's taxonomy and really emphasize both the comprehension and the oral language skills. But instead, there was a lot of typing going on. So this one is not so good. Example 9, word families, ice, ick, id, role play cards. Had students identify unfamiliar words, went over vocabulary using context clues, and reread for fluency and comprehension. The tutor indicates addressing all 6 components. And I would say yes, certainly for some of them, and maybe for others. So phonemic awareness and phonics, we're looking at word families. We're looking at those sounds within words, how do we find them, and then we're going to look at printed words most likely, and pronounce those words out loud. So yes on phonics and phonemic awareness. Fluency, maybe. It depends on what happened during the reread for fluency and comprehension. One of the things I see is tutors will say reading for fluency. The kids are reading silently for fluency. Well, you cannot do any, as we define fluency, that's something that has to be done out loud. So it really depends on what's happening, what it means by reread for fluency and comprehension. Is it out loud? Is there some guidance going on? Well, it's not clear, so I give that one a question mark. For vocabulary, yes, we have that. For comprehension and oral language development, again, it goes back to what is meant by rereading for fluency and comprehension. There's simply not enough information here to tell me what actually happened. How were fluency and comprehension addressed? The tutor listed the topics, but hasn't provided a good description of the activity, so we really don't know how or whether comprehension and oral language development were actually addressed. Example 10. Introduced and modeled synonyms. Some words mean the same or almost the same thing. Guide oral practice, for example, word happy. Oral sentence, I felt happy to see my friends at the playground. Okay, a prompt. What's another word for happy? Glad, cheerful. Then students must write a new sentence. And I'm assuming this is an example. I felt glad to see my friends at the playground. I also used gestures and photographs to illustrate chosen words. That's actually a pretty good description of what happened during this session. I could actually probably recreate that session using this description here. I know exactly what happened. This was a 2-hour session, and this is all that happened during that 2-hour session. What the tutor indicated addressing is vocabulary. One of the basic premises of the BCSCR tutoring model is that every week we're going to address every single reading component. So if we have a 2-hour session occurring once a week, well then in that 2-hour session we should be addressing all of them. This really is not enough instructional content for a 2-hour stretch with the students. And So the tutor indicates vocabulary. I would agree vocabulary. Maybe some oral language development. I'm going to give that one a question mark because as we start thinking about different words and synonyms, we can also say, well, why might you use this one? Or when would that one be more appropriate? And that starts to get us into oral language development. There's nothing here that specifically indicates oral language development, but I can see how it would be very easy to draw oral language development instruction out of this activity. So I'm going to give it a question mark. Certainly vocabulary. But the real problem here is this is an entire week's worth of instruction and the tutor has only addressed vocabulary. The premise is every week we address every component with every student, regardless of the pre-test scores, the age, the reading level, or the grade level. Every week, every component. The data are just clear that that's how we get the best results and the students make the most gains. So this one doesn't cut, to use a cliche, this one doesn't cut the mustard. Example 11. The students will practice timing their reading from their novel for 2 paragraphs. They will focus on intonation and speed. They will practice the same 2 paragraphs and time them each time. The students will work on comprehension quickies where they read short excerpts and answer questions in varying forms. The students will work on long vowel sounds from the phonics book. Advanced students will compose long and short vowel lists with samples. The tutor says that all 6 areas were addressed. Now, thinking about the quality of the instruction, not just the components, but also the quality, I see a lot's going on here and a lot of interesting things. I really like that idea about the repeated reading and, trying to get better and so on. The part that bothers me about this is the timing. The point of fluency is not to read as quickly as possible. The point of fluency is to read accurately, read out loud accurately with the correct expression and an appropriate pace. And pace means a natural speaking voice or a pace which is appropriate for the material being read aloud, which does not mean how fast can you do it. So that's a little bit troubling. I really do not like all of these timed speed drills and so on because it really gives kids the wrong idea about what fluency is. It also says that saying as many words as possible is more important than the message being communicated, and that's simply not true. But we do have a lot of good stuff. We've got some phonemic awareness and phonics going on. Absolutely, we definitely have some fluency. That's sort of the basis for all of this. And we have some comprehension going on. So we've got all of those. The only thing I don't see the vocabulary or oral language development here. I don't actually see anything which says we're studying the meanings of words and discovering new words and those kinds of things. But the other ones, we can give them a pass. Now, generally, when I'm looking at the descriptions of the activities, I will look at some things like this and I'll say, I really don't like that particular strategy, or I question the value of a particular strategy. But the fact of the matter is the tutor was making a good faith effort to address a particular component, so I give them a pass. Okay, it's being addressed even if I think it can be addressed better. Example 12. Read aloud if you take a mouse to the movies. Students practice making predictions, word wheels, reading mini books for fluency, identification of letter names and sounds, choral reading from leveled readers. Students practiced independently for fluency. What the tutor indicates is that phonemic awareness was addressed, and we see that letter names and sounds. That fluency is addressed. We've got that choral reading going on, and oral language is being addressed. Well, when I take a look at this, I say, yes, we have that phonemic awareness for sure. But we also have some phonics going on because the letter names and sounds, we're looking at this letter helps to produce this sound. So that's phonics, going from the written symbol to the oral symbol. So we have that, we have phonemic awareness, we have phonics, we obviously have fluency going on here. I also think that we have comprehension occurring here, a comprehension study, because we have the whole making predictions. What do you What have you read so far? And what do you know about what you've read? So what do you think might happen next? So the student really has to reflect on the content and understanding the content in order to make valid predictions. So I think we've got comprehension going on here as well, even though the tutor didn't indicate it. On the other hand, oral language is a bit shaky. I've got a question mark there. I can see how these activities can lead to addressing oral language development. But there's nothing that is explicitly stating how oral language development is being addressed. So I'm going to give it a question mark. I think we can get there from these activities, even though it's not specifically described in the activities. Example 13, warm up sight word bingo, phonetic word drill with partner, magic treehouse, dinosaur before dark, intro to new vocabulary words, oral and written questions. What would you do? So the tutor indicates all 6 components. I would say yes, we have the phonics and the phonemic awareness going on, that whole sight words bingo and the phonetic word drill. I would say yes, we've got the vocabulary. We don't really know what's happening there, but we know that new vocabulary terms are being addressed. We have oral written in questions, which is going to get us to comprehension. And because we're asking the students to reflect on it and think about it and express their own ideas, hopefully articulately, then we're also going to get to the oral language development. So I agree with everything, but the one piece that I don't see is the fluency. We have oral and written questions, but that's different than reading aloud from the text with appropriate speed and appropriate expression and accuracy. So I would say yes for everything except fluency. Example 14. We worked on a chart on making inferences. They worked in a group. And the tutor indicates addressing everything but phonics. I don't see anything there which would indicate phonemic awareness or fluency. Maybe for vocabulary, depending on what's being done with the inferences. A student says, I think that it means this or it means that. And you can actually do some interesting studies about the language that the author used, which might lead to a particular inference. The word choices that lead to it. So we can study some words there. So that's a maybe. But certainly for doing inferences, we've got some comprehension, and because we have to think about the author's intent and sort of the subtle meaning, or reading between the lines, what else might be implied here, and certainly what can one infer, that's going to give us oral language development. So yes on comprehension, oral language development, no on phonics, phonemic awareness, fluency, and a maybe on vocabulary. But really, this is the only thing that was written in for that day, and frankly, if this is the only thing that the tutor did during the hour-long session, this really isn't enough. There's a lot more that can be done during an hour-long session than just working on a chart, making inferences. And frankly, if I was, to be quite honest, if I were a student in that group, I would probably be a little bit bored. Example 15. So this is our last example. We read Lion's Library. We played a dice game to answer comprehension questions. We sorted vocabulary words and discussed them through the read aloud. Students read aloud the book. And the tutor indicates vocabulary, comprehension, oral language development. And I see all of that there. And actually, a dice game to answer comprehension questions, I don't exactly know what that means. I know there's an activity obviously occurring here. Personally, I'd be interested in knowing a little bit more about that. But that's sort of neither here nor there. There was a specific activity to address comprehension questions. So yes on comprehension. We've got the vocabulary word sorting and we've got the vocabulary discussion. So we've got vocabulary, and we probably have the oral language development piece through the comprehension questions. I probably should give that one a question mark because it's not specifically described, but I can see how you can get from that dice game to the oral language development. It's really going to depend on what the questions are. But one thing I think is missing from the tutor's notes, and that is I think we've also addressed fluency. Because if we're reading aloud the book, then kids are getting some practice in that out loud reading. Now, it doesn't really say we've got that guiding going on. We don't have the repeating going on. We don't know. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. but at least there is something happening, a specific activity happening, described here, that can help students to further develop their fluency. So I would put a check mark on that one also. Okay, so that's 15 examples. Hopefully gives you an idea of what we mean by that alignment between the activity descriptions and the reading components, and how we're looking at them and actually analyzing what it is that people write in their descriptions to describe various reading activities and how we interpret what they write. So a couple of final points. One is there's no way we can predict what you're doing. We cannot guess what you're doing. The only thing that in our office we know about your activities is what you write. So if you don't write something, the assumption has to be that it's not happening. Okay, if you don't give us an activity that talks about oral language development or comprehension, then the only possible assumption is that it's not occurring. We only know what you write. So make sure that your descriptions actually let us know how you're addressing the various reading components that you indicate. The second takeaway, every reading component every week. The third takeaway, make sure you're actually describing activities, not just saying fluency or vocabulary or comprehension. Because if you don't say how you're addressing them, then we're going to assume that you're not addressing them. Okay, so if you say phonics and you don't provide any activities, that's just throwing out words. So what did you do to address phonics? Because if there's not an activity described there, the assumption is going to be that it's not being addressed. So describe the activities. And then obviously the whole point of this video is that whole alignment between the activities and the components. So think about what it is you're doing pretty carefully and what types of specific skills are being addressed in those activities. Do that and then check off the various components that you're addressing, okay? Because they have to align. And I'm always going to look at the activities to see whether or not the reading components are fully being addressed. And then once you do that, reflect on what you've done. Look over the last couple sessions and say, well, what have I actually addressed? Have I done phonics and phonemic awareness and fluency and so forth? Have I actually addressed every one of the components? See, that instructional reporting form really has two purposes. Obviously, it has a purpose for informing us what it is that you're doing and helping to monitor the instruction and monitor the quality of the activities and all of those things. So it's useful for reporting. But it has another very powerful and equally important use, and that is to help you reflect on what it is that you're teaching, what reading components you are addressing, and how you are addressing them. So use it that way, okay? Because we judge, I'll be honest, we judge tutors and their efficacy based on what they report. Specifically, are they regularly addressing, are they weekly addressing the 6 components? So as you're writing down your descriptions and you're checking off components, ask yourself that question. What have I actually addressed? Which components have I addressed? Which ones do I need to address because I haven't touched on them for a while? So use it for those purposes there. And ultimately, we say this all along, and it is just as true now as it was at the beginning. The whole point of the BCSCR tutoring project is to help kids make the very best possible gains in their reading ability. And we know that regularly addressing the 6 components is a necessary part of that process. And we know that there are very clear research-based strategies which are effective at addressing the components. So for you, that means a couple of things. One, yes, absolutely every component every week with every child. And second, really think about the strategies and think about the activities and whether or not they align with the strategies that we know work. So if you're not really clear about the strategies, go back and look at that other video as I mentioned, or look at the other videos we have available. Take a look through the tutor manual because it describes not only the strategies, but it also gives sample activities to address each of the reading components. And you can always, of course, talk to your regional coordinator. There is a lot of support for you. There are many resources available to you as you strive to accomplish the same vision that we are striving to accomplish, and that is every student making the maximum gains in reading. So thank you very much for being a tutor. I hope you find this useful, and I hope it really helps you to reflect on your own instructional practice, because ultimately, with what we do on our end and what you do on your end, we're really going to help these kids in very powerful ways. So thank you for being a tutor with us. Again, my name is David Bowman. I'm the tutoring coordinator for BCSCR. Have a great day.